In the gleaming conference room of a Chicago high-rise, a seasoned investment strategist was about to face corporate betrayal. What started as a routine HR check-in took a shocking turn when they came face-to-face with a 65% salary cut. Noor Amari wasn't your typical corporate employee. For 8 years, she had spent her life building Corveon Capital from a scrappy startup into a powerhouse firm, known for her ability to close impossible deals and cultivate billion-dollar client relationships. When she encountered HR Director Ava Lin sliding that devastating paper across the table, she had no idea she was walking into a calculated conspiracy. Noor's composed acceptance of the 24-hour review period would lead to the systematic dismantling of the very empire that tried to erase her. What began as Reed Ashbury's attempt to quietly eliminate his most valuable strategist would become the greatest strategic miscalculation in corporate finance. The Chicago investment community would never be the same after one phone call exposed how quickly competence flows toward those who truly value it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I thought it was just a routine check-in with HR, until they handed me a paper that changed everything. Ava Lin, the HR director with the perpetually polite eyes and carefully measured smile, was already seated in conference room 12A when I walked in. Sitting beside her was a man I didn't recognize. Charcoal blazer, expensive watch, and an expression like this meeting was just another line item on his calendar. Grant from corporate, apparently. "We appreciate your contributions, Noor," Ava started, her voice gentle in a way that made my skin crawl. "As part of Corveon's new operational alignment, we're adjusting compensation structures to match our evolving strategic objectives." I raised an eyebrow. 2 weeks ago, I'd closed the largest deal in the firm's history, $850 million for the Technova acquisition. Reed Ashbury himself had called it transformational in the all-hands meeting. Now they were talking about adjustments? Grant slid the paper across the table, smooth and silent. I unfolded it, eyes scanning automatically until they caught on the bold numbers halfway down the page. New base salary, $147,000. Effective date, immediate. My current salary was $420,000. My brain stalled. I stared at the paper like the numbers might rearrange themselves if I waited long enough. They didn't. Ava kept talking, something about market conditions and operational streamlining, but I couldn't hear her anymore. All I could feel was my heartbeat echoing in my ears like a drum in an empty room. "This represents a 65% reduction," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "We understand it's significant," Grant replied, his tone clinical. "But given the current market volatility and our need to optimize resource allocation, after the Technova deal?" The words came out sharper than I intended. Ava's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Your contributions to that acquisition are exactly why we're confident you'll understand the strategic necessity of these changes." I nodded, even smiled. The kind of smile I'd perfected in a decade of conference rooms where being the only woman meant every reaction was scrutinized, cataloged, weaponized. "I'd like 24 hours to review this." Ava exhaled like I'd done her a favor. "Of course, we'll need your decision by noon tomorrow." I left without another word, past the row of analysts I'd mentored, past the mahogany walls lined with deal tombstones, including the Technova plaque that still bore my name in gold lettering. I walked all the way to the parking garage, and then I crumbled inside my Mercedes. I broke down. The kind of ugly crying that fogs windows and leaves mascara, streaks on leather seats, hands shaking, chest heaving, because this wasn't a negotiation. It was a public execution dressed up as restructuring. When I finally caught my breath, I pulled the paper back out of my bag. I wanted to understand the damage, to see if there was something I'd missed in my shock. I read every line, every clause, every piece of corporate doublespeak. There was no severance package, No transition bonus, no retention incentive. Just one sentence centered at the bottom that made my blood run cold. Transition support will be provided contingent upon employee cooperation and discretion. That's when I knew this wasn't just cruel, it was calculated. I didn't stumble into this career. I bled my way into it. When I started at Corveon 8 years ago, it was still a scrappy mid-market firm operating out of a converted warehouse in River North. Reed Ashbury was just another ambitious partner with big dreams and a PowerPoint full of market projections. I joined as a junior analyst making $78,000 and answering every client call like it might be the one that kept us afloat. I stayed late, volunteered for the impossible deals, covered holidays when senior staff disappeared to the Hamptons. I learned every system, every client quirk, every regulatory nuance, not because anyone asked me to, but because I believed in what we were building. It felt like we were a team back then. Reed knew everyone's birthday. We celebrated funding milestones with champagne in the break room. When my father had his first heart attack during my second year, I brought my laptop to Northwestern Memorial and worked from the ICU waiting room. When my mother needed help with his medical bills, I didn't ask for an advance. I worked weekends consulting for Reed's contacts under the table. When other firms tried to poach me with higher salaries, I stayed loyal. I believed in the mission. I believed in Reed. Over the next 6 years, I moved from analyst to associate to vice president to senior strategist. I built relationships with pension funds, sovereign wealth managers, family offices worth billions. I handled midnight crisis calls from Dubai, 4 a.m. rollouts for London markets, and fire drills that had executives panicking while I stayed calm, professional, unflappable. My client portfolio grew to $2 billion in assets under management. I led the team that landed our first unicorn startup. I was the one who identified Technova 18 months ago when they were still a Series C nobody, convinced Reed to court them through 3 rounds of financing until they were ready for acquisition. I'd stopped asking for recognition years ago. I assumed the results spoke for themselves. They didn't. After that meeting with HR, when I went home to my Lincoln Park condo and started combing through my employment records, I found something that made my hands shake with more than just rage. My title progression had been updated in internal directories and email signatures, but never formally documented in my contract amendments. That senior strategist role I'd been holding for 2 years? It was announced in a company newsletter, celebrated at our annual retreat, but never legally ratified. I'd been operating at the highest levels of the firm without the contractual protections, without the golden parachute clauses, without any of the safeguards that would shield me from exactly what they were doing now. And the worst part? I never questioned it. I was too busy closing deals, too busy proving myself, too busy being grateful for the opportunity to notice I was being systematically stripped of leverage. Now, staring at that HR document in my kitchen at 11 p.m., surrounded by takeout containers and case files from the Technova deal, I didn't just feel betrayed. I felt surgically dismantled, used with the kind of precision that only comes from years of observation, of mapping someone's blind spots and pressure points. Reed Ashbury had been my mentor, my sponsor, the one who'd pulled me into high-stakes deals and taught me to think like an owner, not an employee. He'd been the first to congratulate me after Technova signed, the one who'd suggested I might be ready for a partnership track. Now I understood why he'd smiled so carefully that day. He'd already made his decision. The handshake was theater. The congratulations were a performance. While I'd been celebrating, he'd been calculating how to erase me from the deal's success story. For the first time in 8 years, I stopped blaming myself for not being strategic enough, political enough, ruthless enough. The game had been rigged from the beginning. I just hadn't realized I was playing it alone. My phone buzzed against the granite countertop. Unknown number, but the area code was familiar. Chicago, probably another recruiter who'd heard whispers about my situation. I almost didn't answer. "Noor, it's Jonas," Jonas Rhee. I sat up straighter. Jonas had been my best analyst 3 years ago, brilliant with data modeling and regulatory research. He'd left Corveon under strange circumstances, something about questioning deal structures and making Reed uncomfortable. We'd lost touch after he moved to New York. I heard what happened. His voice was careful, like he was calling from a bathroom stall. I can't talk long, but you need to check your original employment contract. The founder's clause. They're not as clever as they think they are. The line went dead. I stared at my phone for a full minute, Jonas's words echoing in my head. Then I walked to my home office, opened the filing cabinet I hadn't touched in years, and started digging through contracts I'd signed when Corveon was still small enough to fit in a single floor of a downtown building. Tomorrow I would find out exactly what they'd overlooked. I played Jonas's voicemail 7 times before dawn. Each replay revealed something new in his tone. Urgency masked as casual concern, knowledge disguised as a helpful tip. Jonas wasn't the type to make cryptic calls unless he had solid intel. During his time at Corveon, he'd been obsessive about contract language, the kind of analyst who read footnotes like they contained state secrets. The founder's clause. I'd signed my original employment agreement in Reed's temporary office, back when Corveon operated out of a converted loft space, and the coffee machine was a $20 Mr. Coffee from Target. I barely remembered the specific terms. I'd been so focused on the base salary and equity options that I'd skimmed the legal boilerplate. By 6 a.m., I was sitting cross-legged on my bedroom floor, surrounded by manila folders and employment documents dating back 8 years. My original contract was buried beneath performance reviews, benefits updates, and stock option modifications. When I finally found it, the pages were slightly yellowed, still stapled with Reed's old letterhead, the logo he'd designed himself before they hired a proper brand agency. I read through the standard clauses, confidentiality agreements, non-compete, restrictions, termination procedures. Nothing seemed unusual until I reached page 7, buried in a section titled Founder Protection Provisions. There it was, in language so dense I had to read it 3 times to understand the implications. In the event that an employee's compensation is reduced by more than 30% without cause, or if such reduction is implemented without 60 days written notice, the affected employee may elect to terminate their employment immediately without penalty, forfeiting any post-employment restrictions or non-compete obligations, and retaining all vested equity and accrued benefits. I set the contract down, my hands trembling slightly. 65% reduction, no 60-day notice, no cause beyond operational alignment. They hadn't just breached my contract. They'd handed me a legal escape hatch with a golden parachute. Attached. But why would Reed make such a careless mistake? He was methodical, careful, the kind of lawyer-turned-executive who read every contract 3 times before signing. Unless he'd assumed I'd never read the founder's clause carefully. Unless he'd counted on my loyalty, my tendency to accept rather than challenge. Unless he'd been so focused on pushing me out that he'd forgotten the very protections he'd put in place during the early days, when keeping good people meant offering them security he couldn't afford to provide, in cash. Or maybe it wasn't a mistake at all. Maybe this was exactly what he wanted, for me to invoke the clause and walk away quietly, taking my difficult questions and inconvenient success with me. I needed a second opinion. Micah answered on the first ring, which meant he was all ready. At his law office in the Loop, probably preparing for another civil rights case that would keep him up until midnight. My younger brother had chosen advocacy over profit, social justice over corporate law. But his legal mind was sharper than anyone's I knew. They offered you what? His voice carried the controlled outrage that made him dangerous in courtrooms. A 65% pay cut. Immediate implementation. No negotiation. After your biggest deal ever? 2 weeks after? Silence. Then the sound of papers rustling, probably pulling up employment law precedents on his computer. Noor? This sounds like constructive dismissal. They're trying to force you out without paying severance or dealing with wrongful termination claims. But if you have protection clauses, I do. Jonas Rhee tipped me off to check my founder's contract. There's a provision that lets me walk away clean if they cut my pay more than 30% without cause. Jonas Rhee? I remember him. Smart kid. Left under weird circumstances, right? Right. And Micah. There's something else. The pay cut letter mentioned transition support contingent upon cooperation and discretion. That sounds like hush money. Another pause. When Micah spoke again, his voice had shifted into full attorney mode. Listen carefully. Don't sign anything. Don't agree to anything verbally, and document everything. Emails, meetings, conversations. If they're trying to silence you, it's because they're worried about what you might say. About what? That's what we need to figure out. But Noor, if they tried to erase you this clumsily, it means you were more dangerous to them than they ever admitted. People don't orchestrate elaborate exits for employees they can easily replace. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen drinking coffee that had gone cold, staring at the founder's clause language until the words blurred together. Micah was right. This wasn't just about cost-cutting or restructuring. This was about neutralizing a threat I didn't even know I posed. I thought about the last few months, trying to identify what might have made Reed nervous. The Technova deal had been my idea, my cultivation, my execution. But beyond the obvious success, what had I learned in the process? I set the contract down, my hands trembling slightly. 65% reduction, no 60-day notice, no cause beyond operational alignment. They hadn't just breached my contract, they'd handed me a legal escape hatch with a golden parachute attached. But why would Reed make such a careless mistake? He was methodical, careful, the kind of lawyer-turned-executive who read every contract 3 times before signing. Unless he'd assumed I'd never read the founder's clause carefully. Unless he'd counted on my loyalty, my tendency to accept rather than challenge. Unless he'd been so focused on pushing me out that he'd forgotten the very protections he'd put in place during the early days, when keeping good people meant offering them security he couldn't afford to provide in cash. Or maybe it wasn't a mistake at all. Maybe this was exactly what he wanted, for me to invoke the clause and walk away quietly, taking my difficult questions and inconvenient success with me. I needed a second opinion. Micah answered on the first ring, which meant he was already at his law office in the Loop, probably preparing for another civil rights case that would keep him up until midnight. My younger brother had chosen advocacy over profit, social justice over corporate law, but his legal mind was sharper than anyone's I knew. They offered you what? His voice carried the controlled outrage that made him dangerous in courtrooms. A 65% pay cut. Immediate implementation. No negotiation. After your biggest deal ever? 2 weeks after? Silence. Then the sound of papers rustling, probably pulling up employment law precedents on his computer. Noor? This sounds like constructive dismissal. They're trying to force you out without paying severance or dealing with wrongful termination claims. But if you have protection clauses, I do. Jonas Rhee tipped me off to check my founder's contract. There's a provision that lets me walk away clean if they cut my pay more than 30% without cause. Jonas Rhee? I remember him. Smart kid. Left under weird circumstances, right? Right. And Micah. There's something else. The pay cut letter mentioned transition support contingent upon cooperation and discretion. That sounds like hush money. Another pause. When Micah spoke again, his voice had shifted into full attorney mode. Listen carefully. Don't sign anything. Don't agree to anything verbally, and document everything. Emails, meetings, conversations. If they're trying to silence you, it's because they're worried about what you might say. About what? That's what we need to figure out. But Noor, if they tried to erase you this clumsily, it means you were more dangerous to them than they ever admitted. People don't orchestrate elaborate exits for employees they can easily replace. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen drinking coffee that had gone cold, staring at the founder's clause language until the words blurred together. Micah was right. This wasn't just about cost-cutting or restructuring. This was about neutralizing a threat I didn't even know I posed. I thought about the last few months, trying to identify what might have made Reed nervous. The Teknova deal had been my idea, my cultivation, my execution. But beyond the obvious success, what had I learned in the process? What access did I have? What relationships had I built that might threaten Corveon's control? Then I remembered something that had seemed insignificant at the time. During the final Teknova negotiations, I'd been copied on internal emails about fee structures and profit distributions. Reed had marked several of them as confidential and asked me to keep the details between us. I'd assumed it was standard practice, partners protecting proprietary information from competitors. But what if it wasn't about competitors? What if it was about other clients, other deals, other arrangements that wouldn't look good under scrutiny? I opened my laptop and started scrolling through my email history, searching for patterns I'd missed before. Fee structures that seemed inconsistent, client communications that had been mysteriously redirected, deal announcements where my name had been quietly removed from the attribution. By noon, I had a timeline that made my stomach churn. For the past 18 months, while I'd been focused on closing deals and building relationships, Reed had been systematically distancing me from the profit centers I'd helped create. Not obviously enough to raise red flags, but consistently, enough to establish a paper trail that minimized my contributions. The Teknova deal hadn't just been successful, it had been too successful, with too much client credit flowing directly to me instead of the firm. Reed needed me gone before I realized exactly how much leverage that gave me. But he'd made one crucial error. He'd assumed I'd take the insult quietly, the way I'd accepted every other slight over the years. He'd counted on my loyalty, my professionalism, my tendency to internalize blame rather than assign it. He'd forgotten that loyalty is a two-way street, and when someone breaks their end of the bargain, the other party is free to renegotiate the terms. I picked up my phone and started typing a text to Jonas. Found the clause. You're right. They're not as clever as they think. Thank you. His response came back within minutes. There's more. Check your deal attribution on the internal financial reports. And Noor? Be careful who you trust. This goes deeper than just Reed. I deleted both messages and closed my laptop. Tomorrow, I would go back to the office and play the role they expected. Confused. Hurt. Probably compliant. I would ask questions that seemed reasonable, review documents that appeared routine, and have conversations that sounded like someone trying to understand their situation. But I wouldn't be gathering information for them anymore. I'd be gathering it for myself. And if Reed Ashbury thought 8 years of loyalty made me predictable, he was about to learn the difference between being underestimated and being understood. Walking into Corveon the next morning felt like entering a crime scene where I was both the victim and the detective. The lobby looked the same. Polished marble floors, the Wall Street Journal display, the receptionist's practiced smile. But everything felt different through the lens of betrayal. I'd spent 8 years building relationships in this building, and now I found myself cataloging who met my eyes and who suddenly found their phones fascinating. Marcus from compliance nodded politely. Sarah from marketing looked right through me. David Chen, who'd worked on 3 deals with me, actually crossed to the other side of the hallway. The message was clear. Word had traveled fast. I took the elevator to the 32nd floor, where my office sat in the corner with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Michigan Avenue. The view had always been a source of pride, a visual reminder of how far I'd climbed. Now it felt like A museum exhibit, the office of someone who used to matter. My assistant, Kelly, was already at her desk, but she didn't look up when I approached. "Good morning, Kelly." "Morning, Noor. Reed wants to see you at 10:30, conference room B." Her tone was professional, neutral. Too neutral. Kelly had been my right hand for 4 years, the one who'd stayed late to help with client presentations and remembered my mother's birthday. Now she was speaking to me like I was a stranger requesting directions. "Before that meeting, I need to review some files. Can you pull the Technova integration timeline and the Q3 deal attribution reports? I'll need to check with Reed's office about access to those documents." I studied her face. Kelly was many things: disorganized, chatty, fiercely loyal to whoever signed her paychecks, but she'd never been a good liar. The flush creeping up her neck told me everything I needed to know. Of course, no rush. I spent the next hour in my office, ostensibly reviewing emails but actually observing the patterns around me. Who was visiting whose office? Which conversations stopped when I passed by? What documents were being hastily closed when I entered common areas? The paranoia would have been comical if it wasn't so revealing. They were acting like people with something to hide. At 10:25, I gathered my notebook and headed to conference. Room B. Reed was already there, along with Ava Lin and someone I didn't recognize. A woman in her 50s with silver hair and the kind of confident posture that screamed executive consultant. "Noor, thanks for coming. This is Margaret Winters from Strategic Transitions. She's here to help facilitate our conversation about your future with the firm." A corporate mediator. They were taking this seriously. "I appreciate the support," I said, settling into my chair with the calm I'd perfected over years of hostile negotiations. "I've had a chance to review the compensation adjustment, and I have a few questions." Reed's smile was patient, paternal. The same expression he'd worn when explaining complex deal structures to junior analysts. "Of course. We want to make sure you understand the reasoning behind these changes. The 65% reduction, is that based on performance metrics or market adjustments?" "It's part of a firm-wide realignment to ensure our compensation structure reflects current market realities," Margaret replied smoothly. "Several senior positions are being recalibrated." "Several? How many other senior strategists are taking similar cuts?" A pause. Ava shuffled through her papers. Reed's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "The specific details of other employees' arrangements are confidential," Margaret said finally. "Of course. I'm just trying to understand the broader context." I opened my notebook, where I'd written what looked like personal notes, but were actually carefully planned questions. "The timing is interesting, coming so soon after the Technova close. Will that deal's success metrics be factored into the recalibration?" "Your work on Technova was excellent," Reed said carefully. "But individual deal performance is just one factor in these decisions." "I understand. And the transition support mentioned in the letter. Can you elaborate on what that includes?" Another pause. Margaret and Ava exchanged glances. "We're prepared to offer career transition assistance, professional references, and other forms of support to help you navigate this change," Margaret said. "Contingent upon cooperation and discretion," I quoted from the letter. "Standard language," Reed said quickly. "We want to ensure a smooth transition for everyone involved." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I nodded thoughtfully, made a note. "I'll need to review my original employment contract to understand my options. There might be some clauses that affect how we proceed." Reed's smile didn't waver, but something shifted behind his eyes. "Of course. Take all the time you need." I left the meeting with more questions than answers, but also with confirmation that they were nervous about something. The presence of a corporate mediator, the careful language, the way they'd avoided directly answering anything. It all pointed to a coordinated strategy designed to minimize legal exposure. Back at my desk, I opened my laptop and started systematically documenting everything I could remember from the past few months. Email chains that had been mysteriously dropped from my access. Client meetings where I'd been uninvited at the last minute. Project files that had been reassigned without explanation. The pattern was clearer now. For months, they'd been quietly isolating me from the profit centers I'd helped build, creating distance between my contributions and the firm's success. The pay cut wasn't the beginning of their strategy. It was the culmination. At 2:30, I was reviewing deal attribution reports when someone knocked on my doorframe. Caleb Joe, one of the data analysis interns, stood there holding a stack of files and looking nervous. "Ms. Amari, I have those quarterly reports you requested." I hadn't requested any reports from Caleb, but I gestured him in. "Thank you." Caleb just set them on my desk. As he placed the files down, his hand brushed mine briefly. Something small and metal pressed into my palm. A USB drive. "Is there anything else you need?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "No, that's perfect. Thank you for your attention to detail." He nodded and left without another word. I slipped the USB drive into my jacket pocket and continued working as if nothing had happened. After most of the office had cleared out for the day, I inserted the drive into my laptop. It contained financial metadata logs, internal server access records, and email routing data spanning the past 6 months. Someone had been very carefully documenting digital breadcrumbs, and now they were sharing them with me. The logs told a story that made my hands shake with anger. 3 days before the Technova deal closed, Reed had fast-tracked a compensation review for my position specifically. While I'd been working 18-hour days to finalize the acquisition, he'd been planning my exit strategy. But the logs also revealed something else. Timestamps showing that multiple people had accessed my client files and deal documents after hours, often from Reed's computer. They hadn't just been planning to push me out. They'd been systematically copying my work, my relationships, my institutional knowledge. I was still absorbing the implications when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Coffee tomorrow? I think we should talk. S. Elridge, Sophia Elridge, General Counsel." At Technova, the woman who'd negotiated across from me for 3 months, who'd complimented my thoroughness and precision, who'd told me during our final handshake that she hoped we'd work together again. I typed back, "Absolutely. Name the place." Her response came immediately, "Lou Mitchell's 7 a.m. And Noor, I've been expecting your call." I closed my laptop and leaned back in my chair, looking out at the Chicago skyline as the sun set behind the buildings. 8 hours ago, I'd walked into this office feeling isolated and betrayed. Now I was beginning to understand that I wasn't alone, and that Reed's carefully orchestrated exit strategy might have more holes than he realized. Tomorrow, I would start filling them. The USB drive felt warm in my pocket, like a small fire that was just beginning to catch. By the time I was finished, it would be enough to burn down everything they'd built on the foundation of my stolen work. But first, I needed to understand exactly what Sophia Elridge had been expecting to hear from me, and why she'd been waiting for me to call. Lou Mitchell's at 7 a.m. was exactly what I needed. Dim lighting, the comfortable chaos of breakfast, orders, and enough ambient noise to mask a conversation that could reshape everything. Sophia Elridge was already seated in a corner booth, her silver hair pulled back in a way that made her look more like a philosophy professor than a corporate attorney. She stood when she saw me, extending a firm handshake. "Thank you for meeting. Me, Noor. I wasn't sure you'd respond. Your text was intriguing. You said you'd been expecting my call." Sophia smiled, the kind of expression that suggested she knew more than she was revealing. "Coffee first, then we'll talk." After we'd ordered, she leaned forward slightly. I heard about your situation at Corveon. Word travels fast in our circle, especially when it involves someone of your caliber being treated poorly. My situation? The compensation restructuring, the sudden demotion disguised as market adjustment, the way they're trying to minimize your role in the Technova acquisition. She stirred her coffee deliberately. Noor, I've been practicing corporate law for 23 years. I know constructive dismissal when I see it. I felt something loosen in my chest, the relief of being seen clearly by someone who understood the game. How much do you know? I know that Technova's board specifically requested you remain as the primary post-acquisition liaison. I know. Reed Ashbury told us you were transitioning to other priorities without consulting you first. And I know that the integration timeline we agreed on assumes your continued involvement. The weight of her words settled over me. They told you I was unavailable? Last week. Said you were taking on new strategic initiatives and that the Technova relationship would be managed by a team approach going forward. Sophia's eyes hardened. The problem is, our agreement wasn't with Corveon's team. It was with you. Your reputation, your process, your understanding of our culture, that's what convinced our board to move forward. I set down my coffee cup, my mind racing. What are you saying? I'm saying that if Corveon thinks they can sideline you and keep our business, they're mistaken. Technova doesn't work with firms that lie to us about key personnel changes. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a tablet, scrolling to what looked like an internal dashboard. I've been preparing for this conversation since I heard what they did to you. These are the client metrics and integration protocols you developed for us, the frameworks that made this deal work. The screen showed detailed analytics, client communication logs, and strategic roadmaps that I'd built over 18 months of cultivation. My work, my processes, my relationships with Technova's executive team. I can transfer these to your personal dashboard, Sophia continued. Legally, cleanly. You developed them. You own the intellectual property. If you decide to leave Corveon, there's no reason these relationships and insights should stay behind. I stared at the screen, understanding the magnitude of what she was offering. Sophia, this could what? Give you leverage? Demonstrate your actual value? Show other clients what happens when firms prioritize politics over performance? She smiled. That's exactly the point. Why are you doing this? Because I watched you work for 18 months. I saw how you handled our board's concerns, how you navigated our regulatory requirements, how you turned a skeptical acquisition committee into enthusiastic partners. What Reed did to you isn't just wrong, it's stupid. And I don't do business with stupid people. We spent the next hour going through the technical details. Sophia had already prepared secure transfer protocols that would move all Technova-related client data to encrypted servers I could access independently. Not stealing. These were communications and strategic frameworks I'd developed, intellectual property that belonged to me rather than Corveon. There's something else, Sophia said as we prepared to leave. 3 other major clients have reached out to me in the past week, asking questions about your status. Apparently, word is spreading that Corveon is making changes to their senior team. Which clients? Alder Partners, Meridian Group, and Blackstone subsidiary clients you worked with on the Henley deal last year. They're concerned about continuity. My phone buzzed with a text message. Unknown number again. Eli. Torres here. We should meet. I have a proposition. I showed Sophia the message. Her eyebrows rose. Eli Torres from Reed Capital? Noor, he doesn't make casual calls. If he's reaching out, it means he's been watching your situation and sees an opportunity. For what? To offer you what Corveon never would. True partnership. The chance to build something on your own terms. She gathered her things. But before you talk to anyone else, think about what you really want. Not what you think you should want, but what would make you feel valued, challenged, and properly compensated for what you bring to the table. As we stood to leave, Sophia handed me a business card. On the back, she'd written a personal phone number. Call me after you talk to Torres. I have a feeling you're going to need someone who understands both the legal landscape and the client. Relationships you've built. And Noor. Whatever you decide, Technova will follow your lead. We trust you, not your former firm. Walking back to my car, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Actual power. Not the hollow authority of a corporate title, but the real influence that comes from being genuinely valued by people who understand your worth. Reed had tried to erase me by stripping away my salary and status, but he'd forgotten that relationships aren't owned by firms. They're earned by individuals. And the relationships I'd built over 8 years weren't going to disappear just because he'd decided I was expendable. I sat in my car and called the number Eli Torres had texted from. He answered on the first ring. Noor, I was hoping you'd call. Reed Capital's offices occupied 4 floors of a glass tower in the West Loop, all clean lines and understated elegance. No flashy deal tombstones or ego walls, just confidence that didn't need to announce itself. Eli Torres met me in the C lobby personally, which should have been my first hint that this wasn't a standard recruiting conversation. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe early 40s, with the kind of sharp intelligence that made you pay attention when he spoke. Thank you for coming on short notice, he said as we rode the elevator to the 38th floor. I know this timing isn't ideal, but sometimes opportunity doesn't wait for convenience. His office overlooked Grant Park, with Lake Michigan stretching toward the horizon. The view was different from Corveon's downtown perspective, broader, more expansive, like seeing the city from a place where possibilities mattered more than precedent. I'll be direct, Eli said once we were seated. I've been watching your work for 3 years. The Henley acquisition, the Meridian restructuring, now Technova. You have a gift for seeing value where others see complexity. That's not something you can teach. Flattery isn't necessary, Mr. Torres. It's not flattery if it's strategic analysis. He smiled. And call me Eli. We're going to be working together too closely for formalities. The presumption should have annoyed me. Instead, it felt refreshing. Someone who spoke in certainties rather than corporate hedging. I heard about Corveon's restructuring, he continued. Reed's loss is potentially my gain if you're interested in building something significant. What exactly are you proposing? Eli leaned forward, his expression shifting to pure business focus. I want you to launch a new acquisitions division here. Full autonomy, your own team, direct client relationships. 500,000 base salary, equity participation, comprehensive benefits including full medical for dependents. The number hit me like cold water, more than my original Corveon salary, with upside I'd never had access to before. The catch? No catch, just expectations. I want you to bring the same strategic thinking that made Technova successful. I want you to build relationships with the kind of clients who value long-term thinking over quick returns. And I want you to do it without the political nonsense that holds back most senior professionals. He slid a folder across his desk. This includes the initial budget, staffing projections, and client development timeline. But before you review the details, there's something else you should know. Another folder appeared, this one marked with a familiar name. Jenna Ortiz, your former data analyst from Corveon. She reached out to me 6 months ago, before any of this started. Said she was ready for a bigger challenge and specifically mentioned wanting to work with you again if the opportunity arose. I opened the folder to find Jenna's resume, along with a note in her careful handwriting. If Noor ever leaves Corveon, I want to follow. She's the best strategist I've ever worked with. The note was dated 3 months before my pay cut meeting. How did you know to recruit her? I didn't recruit her. She recruited me. Said Corveon was wasting her talents and yours, and that she'd rather build something new than watch good people get marginalized by corporate politics. Eli's expression was serious now. Noor, I don't just want your skills. I want your judgment about people, your ability to identify talent that others overlook. Jenna is evidence that you see potential before it becomes obvious. I thought about Jenna. Brilliant, ambitious, constantly frustrated by Corveon's hierarchical barriers. She'd been one of the few people who'd understood the full scope of the Technova deal, who'd worked as many late nights as I had to make. It's successful. If I were to consider this, I'd want to bring more than just Jenna. Who else? Maria Santos from Client Relations, Devin Kim from Due Diligence, maybe 2 others from junior levels. I paused. These aren't just good employees. They're people who understand how to build trust with clients, how to see deals from multiple angles. Done. Anyone you want, as long as they're willing to make the move voluntarily. The speed of his agreement was almost disorienting. At Corveon, every hiring decision required 3 levels of approval and months of budget justification. Why is this so easy for you? Because I've been building toward this for 2 years. The acquisitions market is changing, moving away from pure financial engineering toward strategic partnerships that require real relationship skills. You've already proven you can navigate that evolution. I just want to give you the resources to do it properly. Eli stood and walked to the window, hands in his pockets. There's one more thing. I know you haven't formally resigned from Corveon yet. I also know that Reed Ashbury is going to try to make your departure as difficult as possible, probably through legal intimidation and professional reputation attacks. He turned back to me. I have excellent attorneys, and I'm not afraid of fights with competitors who use dirty tactics. If you join Renage, you'll have full legal support for whatever transition battles emerge. You seem very confident that I'll accept. I'm confident that you're too smart to stay somewhere. That doesn't value your contributions. The question isn't whether you'll leave Corveon. It's whether you'll join us or start something entirely on your own. He was right, and we both knew it. The pay cut hadn't just been an insult. It had been a liberation. Reed had inadvertently freed me from any lingering loyalty to a firm that saw me as expendable. I need 24 hours to consider the details. Of course, but Noor, don't take too long. The longer you wait, the more time Reed has to poison wells and complicate your transition. As I gathered the folders, Eli walked me to the elevator. One last question. If you could rebuild your professional life from scratch, what would it look like? I thought about Sophia's question from the morning, about what I really wanted versus what I thought I should want. It would look like solving complex problems with people I trust, for clients who respect the work we do. It would look like being valued for results rather than politics. Then we want the same thing, Eli said as the elevator doors opened. I'll be waiting for your call. Driving home through downtown traffic, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, genuine excitement about my professional future. Not the nervous energy of trying to prove myself, but the calm confidence of knowing I had options. Reed had tried to make me feel powerless, replaceable, grateful for whatever scraps they offered. Instead, he'd pushed me toward people who saw my actual worth and were willing to invest in it properly. Tomorrow, I would walk into Corveon for what might be the last time. But first, I had some calls to make. Conference room 12A felt different at 9 a.m. Smaller somehow, like a stage set that had been impressive in the dark but looked shabby under full lights. Reed was already seated at the head of the table, flanked by Ava Lin and the corporate mediator, Margaret Winters. They'd arranged themselves like a tribunal, which should have been intimidating but instead felt theatrical. I took my seat across from them, placing a single manila folder on the table with deliberate precision. Thank you for meeting with us, Noor, Reed began, his voice carrying the false warmth he used with difficult clients. We're hoping to finalize the transition details today. Transition details? Your acceptance of the restructured compensation package, Margaret clarified. We have the amended contract ready for your signature. I opened my folder and removed 3 documents: my original employment agreement, a printed copy of the Founders Clause, and my letter of resignation. Actually, I'm here to invoke my contractual right to immediate termination without penalty. The silence stretched for 15 seconds. Reed's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes, calculation replacing confidence. I'm not sure I understand, Ava said carefully. The Founders Clause in my original contract allows me to terminate my employment immediately if my compensation is reduced by more than 30% without cause or proper notice. Your offer represents a 65% reduction implemented, with 24 hours notice. I slid copies of the relevant contract pages across the table. According to the terms Reed himself negotiated 8 years ago, this gives me the right to walk away with no post-employment restrictions, full retention of vested equity, and immediate access to all accrued benefits. Margaret was already reading the contract language, her professional composure cracking slightly. Reed hadn't moved, but his jaw was tight. "Noor, let's not get caught up in legal technicalities," he said. "We can work something out that benefits everyone. The legalities are quite clear, but I'm curious about something else." I opened to another page in my folder. "Yesterday I received an interesting call from Sophia Elridge at Technova. Apparently you told her I was transitioning to other priorities, without consulting me first." "That was a miscommunication. Was it? Because according to my records, you've been telling several clients that I'm stepping back from active deal management. Alder Partners, Meridian Group, the Henley follow-up accounts." I met his eyes directly. "Interesting timing, considering these conversations happened before you offered me the pay cut." Reed's mask slipped completely. "Noor, you're making this more complicated than it needs to be. Am I, or am I finally paying attention to details I should have noticed months ago?" I closed the folder. The metadata logs from internal servers show that my client files were accessed from your computer after hours, multiple times over the past 6 weeks. While I was working to close Technova, you were copying my work. Margaret was scribbling notes furiously. Ava looked like she wanted to disappear into her chair. "Those are serious accusations," Reed said, but his voice lacked conviction. "They're serious facts, documented, time-stamped, legally admissible facts." I stood, smoothing my jacket. "Which brings me to my final point. I'm not just resigning, I'm retaining counsel to ensure that my departure protects both my professional reputation and my client relationships." "What does that mean?" Ava asked. "It means that any attempts to disparage my performance, interfere with my professional relationships, or misrepresent my contributions to Corveon's success will result in immediate legal action for defamation and tortious interference." Reed finally found his voice. "You can't just walk away from 8 years and expect. I can walk away from 8 years of being undervalued by people who confused loyalty with stupidity." I picked up my folder. "My formal resignation is effective immediately. HR can coordinate the return of company property and finalization of my equity distribution." I headed toward the door, then turned back. "Oh, and Reed, the next time you try to systematically erase someone's contributions, make sure you understand the contracts you signed. That Founders Clause wasn't just protection for employees, it was protection from executives who mistake manipulation for leadership." The door closed behind me with a soft click that felt like the end of a chapter I'd been writing for too long. In the elevator, my phone buzzed with a text from Eli Torres. "How did it go?" I typed back, "I'm available to start Monday. Let's build something worth our time." His response was immediate. "Welcome to Renage. Jenna's already setting up your office." As the elevator descended through floors that had shaped 8 years of my professional life, I felt something I'd almost forgotten. The clean satisfaction of walking away from people who'd never deserved my best work in the first place. Reed had tried to break me quietly, systematically, with the kind of corporate cruelty that leaves no fingerprints. Instead, he'd freed me to discover what I was actually worth to people who understood the difference between managing talent and managing egos. The lobby that had once represented arrival now felt like departure, not an ending, but a beginning I should have started years ago. My first week at Renage felt like stepping into sunlight after years in a windowless room. The difference wasn't just physical, though the Lake Michigan views and modern workspace were striking. It was cultural. Jenna had already claimed the office next to mine, her dual monitors displaying analytics dashboards that would have required 3 approvals at Corveon. Here, Eli's philosophy was simple. If you need tools to do excellent work, buy them. Look at this, Jenna said, pulling up client metrics on her screen. Full access to Bloomberg Terminal, FactSet, PitchBook Premium, even the regulatory databases we always had to request at Corveon. No budget caps, no permission slips, just do good work. The freedom was almost disorienting. Maria Santos called Tuesday morning to confirm her transition timeline. 2 weeks' notice, then I'm yours, she said. Devin's doing the same. We've been talking, and honestly, none of us realized how much energy we were wasting on office politics until we saw what you were building. By Wednesday, something interesting started happening. My email inbox began filling with messages that had nothing to do with Renage's outreach efforts. Mark Chen from Alder Partners was first. Heard about your move through the grapevine. Can we schedule a call? The interim team at Corveon seems confused about our portfolio strategy. They keep asking basic questions about positions you helped us build 2 years ago. Sonia West from Meridian Group followed the next day. Corveon informed us you're no longer managing our post-merger integration. Problem is, our board approved this deal specifically because of your strategic framework. We need to discuss transition options. Then David Park from Henley Holdings. Reed called personally to assure us that service quality wouldn't be affected by personnel changes. That conversation made us realize we should probably talk to you directly. Each message carried the same undertone. Clients who'd worked with me for years, suddenly understanding that their relationships had been with me, not with Corveon's brand name. These weren't emotional decisions. They were strategic calculations, made by sophisticated investors who knew the difference between institutional marketing and individual competence. By Friday, I'd received similar inquiries from 8 major accounts, representing over $800 million in managed assets. The pattern was becoming clear, and it wasn't subtle. Word was spreading through Chicago's financial community, not as gossip, but as professional intelligence. People who managed serious money were asking serious questions about continuity and competence. The most revealing message came from Sophia Elridge, delivered with characteristic directness. Technova board meeting yesterday. Unanimous decision to pause Corveon integration pending comprehensive review of our partnership structure. We'd like to discuss exclusive arrangements with your new firm. Can you meet Monday? Jenna knocked on my door that afternoon, practically vibrating with excitement. I just got off the phone with 3 different Corveon analysts. Apparently, Reed called an emergency meeting yesterday about client retention protocols. People are asking questions. I leaned back in my chair, watching the late afternoon sun paint Lake Michigan in shades of gold and blue. Reed's carefully orchestrated plan to sideline me was unraveling in real time, and he was just starting to understand the magnitude of his miscalculation. When you spend 8 years building relationships based on trust and competence, those relationships don't evaporate because someone changes your corporate email signature. They follow the person who earned them. My phone buzzed against my desk. Reed Ashbury calling. I sent it to voicemail and went back to reviewing Sophia's integration proposal. Some conversations weren't worth having anymore, and Reed was finally going to learn the difference between authority and influence. The beautiful irony was that his attempt to diminish my value had created the perfect spotlight to demonstrate what that value actually was. Every client call, every concerned inquiry, Every strategic discussion that bypassed Corveon entirely was evidence of something Reed had never understood. In relationship-driven businesses, the relationships belong to the people who build them, not the firms that employ those people. By Monday, I would start showing the market exactly what that principle looked like in practice. Reed called 17 times over the next 2 weeks. I answered once. "Noor, we need to talk." His voice carried the kind of forced calm that executives use when everything is falling apart behind closed doors. "I'm listening. These client departures, you're actively soliciting our accounts. This constitutes targeted interference with existing business relationships, and our legal team considers it actionable." I paused, letting the accusation hang in the air while I watched Devon pack his desk through my office window. Another good person who'd finally had enough of Corveon's toxic culture. "Reed, I'm responding to calls from professionals who prefer working with people they trust. There's a fundamental difference between solicitation and being sought out." I kept my voice level, professional. "You taught me that deals follow relationships, not corporate letterhead. I'm surprised you've forgotten your own lesson." Silence stretched across the line. I could practically hear him cycling through talking points his attorneys had prepared. "Look, we both know how this industry works," he said finally. "Client relationships are institutional assets. You can't just— Can't what? Answer phone calls? Provide strategic advice to people who request it? Continue relationships I spent years building?" I interrupted gently. "Reed, you made a choice about my value to Corveon. The market is making its own choice about my value to them. What do you want from this? Money? A counteroffer? We can negotiate." "Nothing from you," I said, and realized I meant it completely. "That's what you never understood about people like me. We're not motivated by what you can give or take away. We're motivated by the opportunity to do work that matters with people who respect that work." I hung up and immediately forwarded his number to my voicemail system. The numbers told the story Reed didn't want to acknowledge. By month's end, 4 major clients had formally transferred their accounts to Reed, representing $1 billion in managed assets. 3 others had initiated strategic reviews of their Corveon relationships, corporate speak for shopping around. Corveon's Q4 revenue projections dropped by 38% in 6 weeks. Industry publications started noticing. The Wall Street Journal's private equity newsletter mentioned significant account migrations following personnel restructuring at established Chicago firm. They didn't name Corveon directly, but everyone in the industry could read between the lines. The Private Equity International weekly update was more direct. Sources report unusual client movement patterns suggesting relationship-driven departures rather than performance-based transitions. Maria's first week at Reed brought inside intelligence that would have been amusing if it weren't so pathetic. Reed called another emergency partners meeting, she told me over coffee. Apparently, they're implementing new client retention protocols and considering external consultants to assess their service delivery model. Translation: they were panicking and had no idea how to fix what they'd broken. The most telling indicator came from Ava Lin, who sent me a LinkedIn message. "Any chance your new firm is hiring senior HR professionals? Asking for a friend who's exploring strategic career moves in the current market environment." I deleted it without responding. Some bridges burn themselves, and Ava had lit the match. What Reed still didn't understand was how visible his mistake had become. When you systematically push out someone whose value was built on trust and competence, those qualities don't disappear. They relocate. The beautiful thing about relationship-driven business is how it exposes the difference between institutional authority and actual influence. Devon's departure 2 weeks later triggered another wave of questions throughout Corveon. When your best people consistently choose the same competitor, it stops looking like coincidence and starts looking like systematic failure. Jenna showed me the industry chatter on LinkedIn. Analysts and associates from other firms asking careful questions about opportunities, using the kind of coded language that meant they were testing the waters for their own potential moves. Reed had tried to erase me quietly, to minimize my contributions and claim credit for relationships I'd spent years building. Instead, he'd created a masterclass in how quickly competence flows toward places where it's properly valued and supported. The market was rendering its verdict, one client conversation at a time. And Reed was finally learning that in a relationship-driven industry, the person who builds the relationships holds the real power, regardless of what their business card says. The mediation request arrived on embossed Corveon letterhead, delivered by courier on a Tuesday morning like a formal invitation to negotiate a surrender. We believe a private discussion could resolve any outstanding issues to everyone's mutual benefit and the benefit of our respective clients. Micah spread the documents across my dining room table that evening, his prosecutor's instincts already, analyzing angles and leverage points. This isn't about settlement, Noor. This is damage control. They want to stop the bleeding before it becomes permanent reputation damage. What do you think they'll offer? Money, lots of it. Probably with a comprehensive gag order and non-compete restrictions that would effectively end your career in Chicago. He looked up from the papers. The question is what you want from this conversation. We met at the Union League Club downtown. All dark wood paneling and leather-bound authority, designed to make corporate disputes feel like gentlemen's disagreements. Reed arrived with an entourage. 2 attorneys from Kirkland & Ellis, a crisis management consultant, and Margaret Winters, the same corporate mediator from my original HR ambush. I brought Micah and a single manila folder. The conference room overlooked Grant Park, where early autumn was painting the trees in shades of gold and red. Reed looked older than I remembered, with stress lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 6 months ago. Noor, thank you for agreeing to this conversation, he began, his tone carefully calibrated for reconciliation. I'm hoping we can find a path forward that works for everyone involved and protects the interests of our respective clients. Only one of us has a client retention problem, I replied evenly. His lead attorney, a sharp-faced woman who probably billed $800 an hour, slid a bound document across the polished table. We're prepared to offer substantial financial compensation in exchange for a comprehensive resolution of any potential disputes. I opened to the settlement terms. The number was genuinely impressive. 7 figures, enough to fund a decade of independent practice or early retirement. But the conditions were draconian. Complete non-disclosure, geographic non-compete restrictions that would effectively bar me from practicing in the Midwest, and clauses that would prevent me from discussing my Corveon experience with anyone. Ever. Hush money with a professional death sentence attached. Micah opened our folder with deliberate precision, revealing the evidence we'd compiled over 3 months. Metadata logs showing Reed's systematic after-hours access to my client files, email chains documenting the pre-planned isolation strategy, time-stamped records of project reassignments that preceded my pay cut by weeks. My client doesn't require settlement compensation, Micah said with the calm authority that made him dangerous in courtrooms. She has comprehensive documentation of breach of fiduciary duty, constructive dismissal, and potential securities violations related to misrepresentation of client relationship ownership to investors. The crisis consultant started scribbling notes. Reed's face had gone pale. Furthermore, Micah continued, we have testimony from former employees regarding systematic patterns of retaliation against senior staff who questioned leadership decisions. Reed's attorney whispered something urgent in his ear. The woman looked like she was calculating billable hours for a protracted legal battle that her client couldn't afford to fight publicly. However, I interjected, maintaining the same measured tone I'd used in hundreds of successful negotiations, we're willing to execute a mutual non-disclosure agreement acknowledging that both parties acted in good faith throughout this transition, with no admission of wrongdoing by either side. The silence stretched for 30 seconds. Reed stared at the evidence folder like it contained a bomb. "Why?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because destroying you won't rebuild the years you wasted of my career. I'd rather spend my energy creating value than seeking revenge." I closed the folder. "And because the market has already rendered its verdict about what I'm worth." We signed the mutual NDA that afternoon. No money changed hands. No restrictions were imposed. Just a clean separation that acknowledged reality. Reed had made a strategic error, and I had moved on to better opportunities. I walked out of the Union League Club legally bulletproof, professionally vindicated, and completely free to build whatever came next without looking over my shoulder. The best part wasn't winning. It was realizing I'd stopped caring about Reed's opinion months ago. 18 months later, I sat in my corner office at Renage, now Senior Vice President of Strategic Growth, watching the sunrise paint Lake Michigan in shades of rose and gold. The title felt earned rather than assigned, backed by results that belonged entirely to me. The numbers on my monitor told a story that still amazed me. $1 billion in assets under management, a 340% growth rate that had attracted attention from institutional investors across 3 continents. My division had become Renage's fastest-growing practice area, generating returns that validated everything I'd believed about relationship-based investing. Technova's post-acquisition performance had exceeded every projection, creating a case study that Harvard Business School now used in their private equity curriculum. 3 former Corveon clients had brought referrals from their networks: pension funds, sovereign wealth managers, family offices that managed generational wealth. We'd expanded into markets I'd never previously accessed, building a client base that valued long-term strategic thinking over quarterly performance theater. The industry had started calling it the Amari effect, the phenomenon of institutional knowledge and client relationships flowing toward firms that prioritized competence over corporate politics. Bloomberg had run a feature story about relationship migration in professional services. The Financial Times had requested an interview about trust-based asset management in volatile markets. I placed my parents' wedding photo on my desk, next to the series of deal tombstones that now bore Renage's logo in elegant silver lettering. Success looked different when it belonged to you completely, when every achievement was built on genuine value creation rather than survival in a hostile corporate environment. My computer chimed with a new email notification. "Caleb Joe, saw your promotion announcement in the Wall Street Journal. Congratulations on the Harvard case study. Well-deserved recognition. Any chance you're hiring analysts who care more about accuracy than politics?" Asking for myself this time. I smiled and started typing my response. The young man who'd slipped me that first USB drive had graduated summa cum laude from Northwestern and spent 2 years at a bulge bracket firm. Now, he wanted to join the team that valued his integrity over his pedigree. "Caleb, of course we're hiring. When can you start?" Eli knocked on my doorframe, holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing the expression of someone with exceptional news to share. "The California Teachers' Retirement System just approved our proposal," he said, setting a cup on my desk. "Full discretionary mandate for their alternative investments allocation. They specifically requested the team that handled the Meridian restructuring." I looked out at the lake where early morning joggers were starting their routes along the waterfront path. The irony wasn't lost on me. Reed's systematic attempt to diminish my value had become the catalyst for discovering what I was actually capable of achieving when properly supported and genuinely valued. "There's something else," Eli continued. "Corveon's dissolution was finalized yesterday. Reed selling the remaining assets to a New York firm. Apparently, the client departures never stabilized." I felt nothing at the news. No satisfaction, no vindication. Just the quiet recognition that some stories end exactly as they should. Reed had built a firm on relationships he'd never really understood. And when those relationships followed, the people who'd actually cultivated them, there was nothing left to sustain the institution. "Any regrets?" Eli asked. Only that it took me so long to recognize my own worth, I replied. Reed did me a favor, even if he didn't mean to. He forced me to stop accepting less than I deserved. That afternoon, I received a handwritten note from Sophia Elridge. Technova's board voted unanimously to extend our exclusive partnership with Reneage for another 5 years. They said working with your team feels like working with people who actually understand what we're trying to build. The best revenge, I'd learned, had never been revenge at all. It had been the quiet satisfaction of building something worthy of the effort, surrounded by people who understood the difference between managing talent and managing egos. Reed's attempt to erase me had become my liberation. Some gifts come wrapped as insults. The trick is recognizing them in time to say thank you. I opened my laptop and started reviewing proposals for our next acquisition target, a clean energy startup that reminded me of Technova in its early days. Young, ambitious, full of potential that others might overlook. Perfect for the kind of strategic thinking that had always been my strength, now finally deployed in service of something I'd built myself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.